The HOA meeting was packed. Word had spread about the pool incident, and neighbors who hadn't attended in years filled Karen's living room. She stood before them, her prepared resignation letter folded in her sweaty palm. "I owe this community an apology," she began, her voice barely above a whisper. "In my enthusiasm to maintain our standards, I've overstepped legal boundaries and I've lost sight of what community really means." She looked at Rebecca, who sat in the front row with her arms crossed, but her expression softer than expected. "I'll be refunding 14 violations issued over the past 18 months, totaling over $8,000 in improper fines." Gasps echoed through the room. Karen had been so busy being the rule enforcer that she'd forgotten rules were meant to serve the community, not the other way around. "I'm resigning as HOA president, effective immediately," she continued, unfolding her letter. "Wait," Rebecca's voice cut through the murmur of the crowd. She stood up, and Karen braced for the final humiliation. Instead, Rebecca's next words would change everything. "I don't think you should resign. I think you should learn to swim." The room fell silent. Karen stared at Rebecca, completely lost. "Tomorrow morning, 7 a.m., Rebecca continued. "Henderson's pool. It's time you understood what you've been trying so hard to regulate." As the meeting dispersed and neighbors filed out, some angry, some sympathetic, all surprised, Karen found herself alone with Rebecca. "Why?" Karen asked. "After everything I put you through, why would you want to help me?" Rebecca smiled, the first genuine smile she'd given Karen since this all started. "Because I've been watching you for months, and I think underneath all those rules is someone who's forgotten how to live. Plus," she grinned wider, "someone needs to teach you that cannonballs are actually an art form." Karen laughed despite herself, a sound she hadn't made in years. But as Rebecca left, Karen noticed something that made her stomach twist again. A black sedan had been parked across the street during the entire meeting, and through its tinted windows, she was sure she'd seen the flash of a camera. Someone had been documenting tonight's meeting. But who? And more importantly, why? Karen Whitfield's perfectly manicured lawn sprinkler system was executing its 6:47 a.m. precision watering cycle when she spotted the intruder. A woman in a neon pink bikini was doing cannonballs into the Henderson's pool next door, sending chlorinated tsunamis cascading over Karen's prized rose bushes. But that wasn't the shocking part. The shocking part was that Karen recognized the woman. It was Rebecca Martinez, the new homeowner from 3 houses down, the same woman who dared to paint her front door turquoise without HOA approval just last month. "Absolutely not," Karen muttered, her coffee mug trembling with righteous indignation, as she watched Rebecca execute what could only be described as the most obnoxious Betty flop in suburban history. The splash sent water streaming down Karen's freshly Windexed sliding glass door. The third shocking moment came when Karen marched outside in her silk pajamas and bunny slippers, armed with her laminated HOA handbook, only to discover that the Hendersons weren't even home. Their driveway was empty, their house dark. Rebecca had somehow gained access to their backyard and was treating their pool like her personal water park. "Excuse me," Karen's voice cut through the morning air like a fire alarm. "This is private property." Rebecca surfaced, her dark hair slicked back, completely unbothered. "Oh, hey Karen, morning workout, you know how it is." She started backstroking toward the shallow end, as if she owned the place. "The Hendersons aren't home." Karen sputtered, her bunny slippers squelching on the wet concrete. "You can't just." "They gave me the code last week," Rebecca interrupted, pulling herself onto the pool's edge with the grace of an Olympic swimmer. "Said I could use it any time since they're never here during the day." Karen's eye twitched. The Hendersons had never offered her pool privileges, despite her being the HOA president for 3 consecutive terms. That's not the point. There are rules about pool usage, noise ordinances, and, she frantically flipped through her handbook, water droplets smearing the plastic coating. "Look, Karen." Rebecca stood, wringing out her hair. "I get that you like your rules, but this is between me and the Hendersons. Private agreement." But Karen had found what she was looking for. Section 4.2. Pool usage by non-residents requires written HOA approval and proper insurance documentation. She held up the handbook like a holy text. You're in violation. Rebecca laughed, actually laughed, which made Karen's face turn the same shade as her roses. You're really going to cite HOA rules for using a neighbor's pool with permission? Rules are rules, Karen said, but even as the words left her mouth, she realized how petty they sounded. The problem was, she'd built her entire identity around these rules. Without them, who was she? Just another suburban housewife whose husband worked late and whose kids had moved across the country. That afternoon, Karen called an emergency HOA meeting. 5 of the 7 board members showed up to her dining room, sitting around her polished mahogany table like a tribunal. She prepared a PowerPoint presentation titled Pool Violations and Community Standards, complete with enlarged photos she'd taken from her upstairs window. Ladies and gentlemen, Karen began, clicking to her first slide. We have a situation that threatens the very fabric of our community. Board member Janet Phillips raised her hand. Karen, isn't this a bit much for someone using a pool with permission? It's about precedent, Karen insisted, clicking to a photo of Rebecca mid-dive. If we allow this, what's next? Block parties without permits? Garden gnomes exceeding the 2-inch height restriction. The room fell silent. Karen realized she might have gone too far with the garden gnome comment. Half the board had garden gnomes. By the meeting's end, Karen had convinced them to send Rebecca a formal violation notice. But as she sealed the envelope that evening, something twisted in her stomach. She thought about Rebecca's carefree laughter, the way she'd looked so at home in the water. When was the last time Karen had felt that free? The violation notice was delivered the next morning. By noon, Karen's doorbell was ringing. We need to talk, Rebecca said, standing on Karen's doorstep with the crumpled notice in her hand, and an expression that was equal parts angry and bewildered. Karen's hands shook as she poured 2 glasses of iced tea, though she wasn't sure why she'd invited Rebecca inside. The woman sat at her kitchen island, the violation notice spread between them like a treaty waiting to be signed. $1,500? Rebecca's voice cracked slightly. For using a pool with permission, the fine covers administrative costs, violation processing, and potential insurance liability, Karen recited, though the words tasted bitter. She'd calculated the maximum allowable penalty, thinking it would teach Rebecca a lesson about respecting community standards. Karen, I'm a single mom. I work 2 jobs just to afford the mortgage on this place. Rebecca's composure was slipping. Do you have any idea what $1,500 means to me? Something in Rebecca's voice made Karen's chest tighten. She'd never asked about her neighbors' circumstances, only whether their lawn edges were properly trimmed and their garbage cans stored correctly. The HOA doesn't make exceptions based on personal financial situations, she said, but the authority was draining from her voice. Of course not. Rebecca laughed bitterly. God forbid the almighty HOA show some humanity. The doorbell rang, interrupting the tension. Through the frosted glass, Karen could see the silhouette of Tom Henderson, back from his business trip a day early. Her stomach dropped. Karen. Tom's voice was confused as she opened the door. What's this about Rebecca owing money for pool usage? She called me panicking. The 3 of them stood in Karen's entryway, and suddenly the situation looked different through Tom's eyes. I told her she could use the pool anytime, he continued. My wife's idea, actually. We're never home, and Rebecca's been so helpful with our packages and watching the house. Karen felt the ground shifting beneath her feet. But the HOA rules clearly state, the HOA rules are for community pools and common areas. Tom interrupted. This is my private pool on my private property. You can't find someone for using my pool with my permission. Rebecca looked between them, hope flickering in her eyes. So the fine isn't valid? Karen's mouth opened and closed soundlessly. In her zealousness to maintain order, she'd misapplied the very rules she'd memorized. The pool regulations she'd cited were indeed for community amenities, not private residential pools. 3 years of law school before she dropped out to get married suddenly seemed relevant again. Karen started, then stopped. The truth was crushing. She'd been so eager to assert her authority that she'd made a massive legal error. I may have misinterpreted the applicable statute. Tom's expression softened slightly. Karen, what's really going on here? This isn't like you to make mistakes with HOA rules. The question hit harder than any accusation. Karen had been HOA president for so long that the rules had become her identity, her purpose, her way of feeling important in a life that had gradually shrunk to the size of her pristine house. But in trying to maintain that identity, she'd become something she never intended, the neighborhood villain. I'll resign the fine, Karen said quietly, the words scraping her throat raw. But Rebecca wasn't finished. That's not enough, she said, her voice gaining strength. I want a formal apology at the next HOA meeting. And I want a review of all the fines you've issued in the past year. Karen's face burned. That's not necessary. It is, Tom said firmly. If you made this mistake with Rebecca, how many other neighbors have been wrongly penalized? The next 2 weeks were the longest of Karen's life. She spent sleepless nights reviewing every violation she'd issued, cross-referencing regulations, discovering error after error. Her meticulous record-keeping, once her pride, now revealed a pattern of overreach that made her sick to her stomach.